Trump halts strikes against Iran. Is this Bible prophecy? For 3 weeks, the world watched the Iran war spiral out of control, as President Trump and Israel ordered thousands of airstrikes. Iranian ballistic missiles screaming across Israeli skies. And then, suddenly, everything changed. You will be shocked by 7 facts about this. Number 1, what Trump just said. On March 23, 2026, President Trump posted the following statement to Truth Social. I'm going to read it in full because every phrase carries weight. I am pleased to report that the United States of America and the country of Iran have had, over the last 2 days, very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. Based on the tenor and tone of these in-depth, detailed, and constructive conversations, which will continue throughout the week, I have instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period, subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions. Now here's what makes this announcement so striking. Because 48 hours earlier, the same president issued the most aggressive ultimatum of the entire conflict. On Saturday, March 21st, Trump gave Iran 48 hours to fully reopen the Strait of Hormuz, or face the destruction of Iran's power plants, starting with the biggest one first. That was the threat. Total. Unequivocal. Destroy your Navy's blockade, or we destroy your grid. And then, less than 48 hours later, the tone reversed completely. From obliteration to conversation. From ultimatum to pause. From, we will destroy your power plants, to, we are having productive discussions. In the space of 2 days, the trajectory of the conflict shifted from escalation toward something that sounded, for the first time since the war began, like the possibility of peace. This was not a ceasefire. The war continues. Israeli strikes on Iranian military targets are ongoing. Operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon persist. The broader military campaign, Operation Epic Fury, has not been suspended. But the most economically devastating element of the conflict, the strikes that threaten to plunge the global economy into energy collapse, has been paused, and the stated reason is diplomacy. Now here's what you need to understand about what was halted and what wasn't, because the distinction matters for both the geopolitical picture and the prophetic one. What was halted? Strikes on power plants, strikes on energy infrastructure, the category of targets that, if destroyed, would have collapsed Iran's electrical grid, shut down its remaining industrial capacity, and sent shockwaves through every energy market on Earth. These are the targets that the global economy feared most, because destroying Iran's energy infrastructure doesn't just hurt Iran. It destabilizes the entire world. But here's what was not halted. And this is the detail that most people missed in the initial reaction. The broader military campaign continues. Strikes against Iranian ballistic missile facilities, ongoing. Strikes against IRGC leadership compounds, ongoing. Israeli operations against Hezbollah, ongoing. Naval operations in and around the Strait of Hormuz, ongoing. The war did not end. But the single most destabilizing element of it, the one that threatened to turn a regional conflict into a global economic catastrophe, was pulled back from the edge. The war didn't end, but one critical part of it did. And that distinction between a war that continues and the most dangerous escalation within it being paused is what creates the prophetic question this entire message is built around. Now here's why this specific pause matters more than any military strike in the entire conflict. And this is the insight that connects the geopolitics to the prophecy. Energy targets are not like military targets. When you destroy a missile facility, you degrade an adversary's capability. When you destroy a leadership compound, you disrupt command and control. These are military outcomes with military consequences. But when you destroy a nation's power grid, when you take down the electrical infrastructure that runs hospitals, water treatment plants, food storage, communications, and civilian life, you don't just win a battle. You collapse a civilization. And the ripple effects extend far beyond the target nation. Iran's energy infrastructure is connected to the global system. Its oil exports, its gas production, its position as a transit point for energy flows through the Gulf, all of it touches every economy on Earth. Destroying it would have sent oil prices past $150 a barrel. It would have triggered a global energy crisis that dwarfed the 1973 embargo. It would have pushed Europe, Asia, and the developing world into an economic contraction that could last years. But here's what makes the decision to pause these strikes prophetically significant. Because the pause doesn't just prevent economic catastrophe, it creates diplomatic space. And diplomatic space is where covenants are made. Stopping strikes on energy slows down the entire conflict. It reduces the pressure. It lowers the temperature. It creates the conditions under which negotiations can happen. Real negotiations, not just back-channel whispers. And the Bible says the event that starts the final countdown is not a war. It is a deal, a covenant, an agreement born from exactly the kind of pause we witnessed this morning. Now here's the choke point that made the energy strikes so dangerous. And understanding it is essential to understanding why the pause is so significant. Because everything that happened in this war, every ultimatum, every escalation, every price spike, every panicked headline, traces back to one narrow body of water that most people couldn't find on a map 3 weeks ago. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The shipping lanes that tankers actually use are even narrower, 2 miles in each direction, separated by a 2-mile buffer zone. Through those 4 miles of navigable water flows approximately 21 million barrels of oil every single day, roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Saudi oil, Kuwaiti oil, Iraqi oil, UAE oil, Qatari liquefied natural gas. The energy that heats European homes, powers Asian factories, fuels American transportation, and keeps the global economy functioning passes through a gap you could see across on a clear day. And Iran controls the northern shore. But here's what most people don't realize about Iran's ability to disrupt the strait. Because it's not just about missiles. It's about a layered denial system that was designed specifically for this scenario. And the layers make the choke point far more dangerous than a simple blockade. The first layer is naval mines. But here's what makes the second layer even more threatening. Because mines are passive. This layer is active. The second layer is anti-ship missiles. Iran has deployed the Noor, the Qadr, and the Khalij Fars, a ballistic anti-ship missile specifically designed to strike moving vessels. These are positioned along Iran's southern coastline and on islands within the strait. And here's what makes this crisis prophetically significant. Because the Bible describes the end times world as a system so interconnected, so fragile, and so dependent on centralized control that a single disruption can cascade through the entire global order. Revelation 18 describes Babylon's fall happening in 1 hour. Merchants weeping, shipmasters mourning, kings lamenting. because the system that sustained their wealth collapsed faster than anyone believed possible. The Hormuz crisis is a preview of that fragility. One choke point, one nation, one decision, and the entire global economy trembles. And the pause Trump announced this morning is the first step back from that edge. Now, here's where I need to transition, because everything I've shown you so far has been geopolitics, facts, events, verifiable developments. But when people who study Bible prophecy saw Trump's announcement this morning, they didn't just see a diplomatic maneuver. They saw a pattern. The pattern is, war creates the conditions for a deal. And the deal, according to the prophet Daniel, is what starts the final countdown. Not the war, the deal. Not the missiles, the handshake. Not the destruction, the agreement that comes after the destruction, when the world is exhausted, desperate, and willing to accept almost any solution that promises stability. When war suddenly pauses, prophecy students pay attention. Because the pause is not the end of the story. It may be the beginning of the most important chapter. Now, let me show you the verse that has been sitting in the book of Daniel for 2,600 years, waiting for a moment that suddenly looks very different than it did 3 weeks ago. Because this single sentence contains the most important prophetic trigger in the entire Bible, and every word of it is relevant to what happened this morning. Daniel 9:27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. This is the verse that starts the clock. The confirmation of a covenant, a deal, an agreement, a treaty, involving many nations for a period of 7 years. And when that covenant is confirmed, the final countdown of human history begins. The tribulation, the abomination of desolation, the judgments of Revelation, the return of Christ. Everything flows from this verse. And the event it describes is not a war. It is a deal. Now here's what makes Daniel 9:27 unlike any other prophecy most people have studied. Because it contradicts the assumption that most people carry about how the end times begin. They assume it begins with destruction, with invasion, with cataclysm, with something loud and unmistakable. But Daniel says the opposite. The trigger is not violence. It is agreement, not war. Peace, not destruction. Resolution. The most important prophecy in the end times does not begin with missiles falling. It begins with leaders shaking hands. And here's why that distinction matters right now. Because what happened this morning is a shift from the loud phase to the quiet phase, from the missiles to the conversations, from the war to the possibility of a deal. And the Bible says the quiet phase is the dangerous one, because the deal that starts the tribulation will not look dangerous. It will look like exactly what the world has been praying for. Now here's the detail that most people miss about Daniel 9:27. And getting it right changes what you should be watching for. Because the verse doesn't say, "He shall create a covenant." It says, "He shall confirm one." The Hebrew carries the meaning of strengthening, making firm, causing to prevail. The agreement already exists in some form. The Antichrist's role is to enforce it, to take a deal that has been negotiated, debated, and partially agreed upon, and to give it the authority and enforcement mechanism that makes it binding. And here's what makes that distinction so relevant right now. Because the framework for a comprehensive Middle East peace agreement is not hypothetical. It exists. The Abraham Accords normalized relations between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. Discussions about expanding those accords to include Saudi Arabia have been active for years, and the current war, by devastating Iran, destabilizing the Gulf, and creating universal demand for a resolution, is producing the exact conditions under which an existing framework could be confirmed, strengthened, and enforced by a leader the world is desperate to follow. Now, here's the prophetic pattern I need you to see, because it is the pattern that runs through the entire biblical narrative and reaches its climax in Daniel 9:27. Chaos, then peace, then betrayal. The first half of Daniel's covenant is peace. The deal works. The missiles stop. The economies recover. The temple worship is restored. 3.5 years of functioning agreement, long enough for the world to relax, for gratitude to become loyalty, for the systems of control to be quietly integrated into the fabric of daily life. And then the midpoint. In the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. The same leader who brokered the peace breaks it. He enters the temple. He stops the sacrifices. He declares himself God. The peacemaker reveals himself as the Antichrist. And the Great Tribulation, the worst period in the history of the human race, begins. But here's the detail that should haunt you. Because the betrayal only works if the peace was convincing. The world doesn't trust the Antichrist for 3.5 years because it's stupid. It trusts him because the peace was real. The missiles really did stop. The economies really did recover. The deal really did work for a while. And that's what makes the betrayal so devastating. The trust was earned. And then it was weaponized. Now, here's where I maintain the guardrails, because getting this right matters more than any dramatic claim I could make. Trump's 5-day pause is not the confirmation of the covenant. It is a conditional, temporary postponement of one category of military strikes, announced via social media, with no formal agreement signed, no treaty ratified, no 7-year timeline established, and no provisions involving Israel's temple, territory, or religious access. Furthermore, Iran has publicly denied any talks. The foreign minister rejected the premise. IRGC spokespeople mocked the announcement. The identity of who the United States is even negotiating with remains unclear, given that most of Iran's senior military and clerical leadership has been killed or gravely injured in the preceding 3 weeks. There is no confirmed negotiating partner, no confirmed framework, and no confirmed path to resolution. No covenant has been confirmed. No temple sacrifices have been restored. No 7-year deal has been signed. No leader has emerged who fits the full prophetic profile of the Antichrist as the covenant confirmer. The specific, unmistakable event that Daniel 9:27 describes has not occurred. But here's what the honest assessment also requires. And this is what separates responsible teaching from dismissive teaching. Because the fact that the prophecy hasn't been fulfilled doesn't mean the conditions aren't forming. A 5-day pause is not a covenant, but it is the first diplomatic signal in a war that has produced nothing but escalation until today. And the trajectory from pause to negotiation, to framework, to agreement to covenant is shorter than most people realize, especially in a world that is desperate for resolution. This is not the prophecy, but it may be the earliest visible step in the process that produces it. And here's what adds a layer of prophetic specificity that no honest observer can ignore. Because the nation at the center of this pause is the same nation the prophet Ezekiel named 2,600 years ago. Ezekiel 38:5. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Persia, modern Iran, named in a prophecy about a latter-days coalition against Israel. And right now, Persia is at the center of everything. Its military being broken, its leadership destroyed, its energy infrastructure under threat, and its relationship with Russia and Turkey deepening under the pressure of the conflict. But here's the question that connects the pause to the coalition. Because a weakened Iran doesn't disappear from the prophetic picture. It becomes more dependent on Russia, more desperate for allies, more willing to join exactly the kind of coalition Ezekiel described. The war that is breaking Persia's military power may be the war that drives Persia into the arms of the alliance the prophets foresaw. And the pause that just shifted the trajectory of the conflict, the pause that created the first diplomatic window, may be the pause that determines what kind of Iran emerges on the other side of this war. A reconciled Iran that integrates with the West? Or a humiliated Iran that binds itself permanently to Moscow and Ankara? The answer to that question may determine whether the Ezekiel 38 coalition forms in this generation. So what should you be watching in the days and weeks ahead? Because the 5-day window is ticking, and the prophetic implications will become clearer as events unfold. Watch for the pause to extend into formal negotiations. If the 5-day halt leads to a ceasefire framework, if the conversations Trump referenced become structured diplomatic talks involving multiple nations, the trajectory toward a covenant-like agreement accelerates dramatically. But here's what makes the second indicator even more critical, because it's the one that connects diplomacy to the temple. Watch for any agreement that involves Israel. Daniel's covenant revolves around Israel, its security, its borders, its religious access. If the resolution of this war produces a comprehensive Middle East peace framework that includes Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia, security guarantees, and, critically, any arrangement involving the Temple Mount, the prophetic profile of the agreement deepens exponentially. Watch for a leader who emerges with unusual authority. The Antichrist doesn't appear as a villain. He appears as a solution. If a figure emerges from this crisis, who brokers the deal that no one else could broker, who commands respect from Washington, Tehran, Jerusalem, Riyadh, and Moscow simultaneously, that figure deserves prophetic scrutiny, regardless of who he is. And watch for global enthusiasm. When the world celebrates a peace agreement with unanimity, when every nation applauds, when the criticism vanishes, when the deal is universally praised as the greatest diplomatic achievement in modern history, that unanimity is itself a warning sign. Because biblical peace divides, and counterfeit peace unifies. Now let me make sure you understand what this message is really about. Because I have not shown you these things to make you afraid. I have shown you these things to make you aware. Prophecy was never given for speculation. It was given for preparation. It was given so that when the events unfold, the people of God would recognize them and respond with faith, not fear, with readiness, not panic, with the quiet confidence of a person who knows that the King is coming, and that the birth pains, no matter how intense, have a destination. The war is real. The pause is real. The diplomatic shift is real. And the connection to Daniel 9:27, while not fulfilled, is closer today than it was yesterday. The trajectory is moving toward the prophetic picture, and the person who sees the trajectory is the person who is ready for what comes next. Romans 10:9. that if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. The foundation that holds when everything else cracks is not a ceasefire. It is not a 5-day pause. It is not a diplomatic framework or a presidential announcement. It is Christ. And the time to build on that foundation is now, while the pause holds, while the door is open. Orders given to deploy 82nd Airborne Division to Middle East. Is this Bible prophecy? The Trump administration just gave an order that changes the trajectory of the entire conflict. Something different. Something that, in the history of American military operations, has always signaled one thing. The war is about to enter a phase from which there is no easy exit. Is this Bible prophecy? You will be shocked by 5 facts about this. Number 1. The order itself. Let me break down exactly what was reported. In March 2026, the commander of the 82nd Airborne Division and his headquarters staff have received orders to deploy to the Middle East. This is not a full division deployment, not yet. It is the command element, the leadership, the planning staff. The people who arrive first to establish the infrastructure, the communications, and the operational framework that thousands of combat troops will use when they follow. And here's the detail that military analysts immediately recognized, because this is the signal that distinguishes preparation from posturing. When the Pentagon deploys a division commander and his headquarters to a theater, it means the decision space for ground operations has narrowed. The command element doesn't deploy to observe. It deploys to command. And you don't need a command element in theater unless you expect to have forces in theater that need commanding. But here's what makes this particular unit so significant. Because the 82nd Airborne is not a standard infantry division, it is the United States Army's Global Response Force. Its designated mission is to deploy anywhere on Earth within 18 hours of notification. It maintains a brigade combat team on permanent alert status, bags packed, aircraft loaded, paratroopers ready to jump into a combat zone with no advanced preparation, no established base, no friendly infrastructure waiting for them. They go first, they go fast, and they go into the most dangerous environments the military can identify. This is not routine. This is not reinforcement. This is preparation for something that changes the character of the war entirely. Now, here's what you need to understand about this unit, because its history tells you everything about why this deployment matters. The 82nd Airborne Division has been the first American force on the ground in virtually every major conflict since its activation. Normandy, June 6, 1944. Paratroopers of the 82nd jumped into occupied France hours before the beach landings, seizing bridges and disrupting German defenses behind the lines. Operation Market Garden, September 1944. The 82nd jumped into the Netherlands in the largest airborne operation in history. But here's the pattern that should make you pay attention, because every time the 82nd deploys to a theater, it means the United States has decided that air power alone is not sufficient, that the objectives cannot be achieved from 30,000 feet, that someone at the highest levels of the Pentagon and the White House has concluded that ground forces are necessary to accomplish what bombs cannot. When this unit moves, it means something bigger may follow. It always has. And the history of the 82nd Airborne suggests that the deployment of its command element is not the end of the escalation. It is the beginning. And the 82nd Airborne is not deploying into a vacuum because thousands of Marines are already converging on the same region. And the combination of airborne and amphibious forces tells you exactly what kind of operations the Pentagon is preparing for. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, approximately 2,200 Marines and sailors, is aboard the USS Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group, redirected from the Indo-Pacific and expected to arrive in the CENTCOM area of operations as early as Friday, March 28th. The 11th Marine Expeditionary Unit, approximately 2,500 Marines from Camp Pendleton, departed San Diego aboard the USS Boxer on an accelerated deployment schedule just days ago. Together, these two MEUs represent roughly 5,000 Marines with full amphibious assault capability. Landing craft, helicopters, Osprey tiltrotor aircraft, F-35B stealth fighters, and the infantry trained to seize and hold territory from the sea. But here's what makes the combination of airborne and amphibious forces so significant. Because each one is designed for a different type of assault, and together they cover every possible ground operation the Pentagon might be considering. The 82nd Airborne assaults from the air, parachute drops, helicopter insertions, vertical envelopment of targets that cannot be reached from the sea. The Marines assault from the sea, amphibious landings, beach seizures, island operations. Together, they can attack a target from every direction simultaneously, above, from the coast, and from the air. And the targets in the current conflict that would require that combination are specific. The Strait of Hormuz, the islands that control it, and Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal. This is not just reinforcement. This is positioning. Positioning for operations that airstrikes alone cannot accomplish. Now, let me make sure you understand the scale of what has already happened. Because the ground force deployment is being added to a military campaign that is already the largest American combat operation in the Middle East in over 2 decades. Operation Epic Fury, launched February 28, 2026, has now been running for nearly 4 weeks. Over 9,000 targets struck inside Iran. Over 9,000 combat flights conducted. More than 140 Iranian naval vessels damaged or destroyed, effectively eliminating Iran's conventional navy. Iran's ballistic missile capability reduced by an estimated 86%. Its air defense network suppressed. Over 40 senior IRGC commanders and clerics eliminated. Nuclear facilities struck. Command and control infrastructure degraded across the entire country. But here's what that massive air campaign has not accomplished. And this is the gap that the ground forces are being deployed to fill. Iran's regime has not fallen. The IRGC, despite losing leadership, continues to function. The Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted. Iranian mines, missile batteries, and fast attack boats continue to threaten commercial shipping. Karg Island, through which 90% of Iran's oil exports flow, remains in Iranian hands. And Iran continues to launch ballistic missiles and drones at Israel and Gulf state targets, demonstrating that its will to fight has not been broken, even if its capacity has been degraded. This war has already reached a scale most people don't fully grasp, and the deployment of ground forces signals that the scale is about to increase again. Now, here's the question that the 82nd Airborne Deployment forces everyone, from the Pentagon to the prophecy student, to confront. Because it is the question that has defined every American military engagement of the past 80 years. Airstrikes can weaken a country. They can destroy its infrastructure, degrade its military capability, eliminate its leadership, and make its population suffer. But airstrikes, in the entire history of modern warfare, have rarely, on their own, changed a regime. They have never, by themselves, forced a government to capitulate when that government is willing to absorb the punishment and continue fighting. But here's the question that makes this prophetically significant. Because deploying American ground forces into the Middle East, into the region the prophets wrote about, against the nation the prophets named, moves the military picture closer to the prophetic picture in a way that no airstrike ever could. But here's what makes the Karg scenario prophetically relevant. Because seizing Iran's oil export hub would not just be a military operation, it would be an economic operation. It would reshape the global energy order. It would determine who controls the oil that powers the world's economies. And control of energy is control of nations, which is exactly the kind of leverage the Bible describes the end-time system wielding over the entire earth. If ground forces are used, this could be one of the first targets. And the consequences, military, economic, and prophetic, would ripple across the globe. Now, here's the development that most people missed in the headline rush. And it reveals a vulnerability that the United States does not want the world to see. The USS Gerald R. Ford, one of 2 aircraft carrier strike groups deployed to the Middle East, has pulled into Suda Bay, Crete, for emergency repairs. On March 12th, a fire broke out in the carrier's laundry and sleeping quarters. The fire burned for over 30 hours before it was fully contained. Approximately 200 sailors were treated for smoke inhalation. Berthing spaces were damaged, and the ship, which has been deployed continuously since June 2025, including operations related to Venezuela, before being redirected to the Middle East, is now potentially sidelined for weeks. Some analysts suggest the combination of fire damage and deferred maintenance from the extended deployment could take the Ford out of commission for months, possibly over a year. But here's what that means operationally. Because the Ford's withdrawal reduces American carrier presence in the region by 50%. 1 carrier strike group instead of 2. Fewer aircraft available for strikes. Fewer defensive platforms protecting the fleet. And a gap in coverage that the 82nd Airborne and the Marine deployments may be partially intended to fill. Even the most powerful military in the world is not invincible. Carriers break down, equipment wears out, sailors suffer injuries, and the strain of sustained operations, week after week of combat flights, missile defense, and around-the-clock readiness, degrades capability in ways that no amount of technology can fully prevent. The Ford's fire is a reminder that military power has limits, and the deployment of ground forces may reflect, in part, the recognition that those limits have been reached in the air and naval domains. Now, here's why this deployment feels different from previous military movements in the conflict. And the reason is not just the scale, it is the convergence. American combat aircraft on Israeli soil for the first time in history. F-22s at Ovda Air Base. Tanker aircraft at Ben Gurion Airport. 4 carrier strike groups in or heading toward the region. Over 50,000 U.S. troops in the Middle East. 2 Marine expeditionary units converging from opposite sides of the globe. And now, the 82nd Airborne, the tip of the spear for ground operations, deploying its command element to the theater. But here's what makes the convergence more than just military escalation. Because the forces are not just American. This is a multinational concentration of military power in and around the land the prophets wrote about. Israeli forces conducting simultaneous operations in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. Gulf state militaries on high alert. NATO allies monitoring the situation. Russian naval assets in the Eastern Mediterranean. Every major military power on Earth has assets positioned in or near the Middle East right now. The scale of deployment, the proximity to Israel, the multinational character, the potential for escalation beyond anything the current conflict has produced. This is not one deployment. It is a concentration of Gentile military power in the biblical lands that has no precedent in the modern era. Now, here's where I need to transition, because the military facts are what they are: verified, documented, reported by credible sources. But the question millions of people are asking goes beyond military analysis. When nations begin moving armies into the Middle East, when ground forces deploy to a region where the prophets place the final conflicts of human history, people begin asking deeper questions. Questions that CNN won't address. Questions that the Pentagon briefing room won't answer. Questions that only the Bible speaks to. Is this part of a prophetic pattern? Are we watching the nations converge on the land the Bible says they will converge upon? Is the movement of armies into the Middle East American, Israeli, Iranian, Russian? The kind of military buildup that the prophets described as a sign of the latter days? And here's why those questions are legitimate. Because the Bible does describe a time when the nations of the earth gather military forces in the Middle East. It names the region. It names specific nations. And it describes the purpose of the gathering. And the current concentration of military power matches the biblical description more closely than anything the modern world has witnessed. Now let me show you what the Bible says about nations moving military forces into this region, because the prophetic picture is not vague. It is specific, and the specificity is what makes the current moment so striking. Ezekiel 38 describes a coalition of nations led by Gog from the land of Magog, allied with Persia, Turkey, Sudan, Libya, and others, that invades Israel in the latter days. The coalition is multinational. The invasion is massive. The target is specific: Israel. And the timing is the latter years, a period the prophets describe as the end of the age. And here's the verse that should make everyone watching the current troop movements pay very close attention, because it describes the mechanism by which the nations are drawn into the conflict. Ezekiel 38:4. And I will turn thee back, and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Hooks in the jaws. God draws the nations, not by accident, not by coincidence, by sovereign design. The nations believe they are making strategic decisions, deploying forces, projecting power, securing interests. But God is the one pulling them toward the land. The 82nd Airborne's deployment orders came from the Pentagon, but the prophetic picture says the deeper orders come from a throne that is higher than any command structure on Earth. But here's what makes the current situation even more specific. Because Ezekiel doesn't just describe generic nations, he names them. And here's the verse that names the nation the 82nd Airborne is deploying to confront. Because Ezekiel doesn't just describe a generic coalition. He identifies the members by their ancient names. And the first ally listed is the one at the center of this war, Ezekiel 38:5. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Persia, modern Iran, the nation the 82nd Airborne is deploying to confront. The nation whose military infrastructure has been devastated by 9,000 airstrikes. The nation whose leadership has been decapitated. The nation whose strait is being contested by marine assault ships. Named explicitly unmistakably 2,600 years in advance. As a member of the End Times coalition that moves against Israel. And here's what makes the current war so significant for the Ezekiel 38 timeline. Because the war is not just weakening Iran, it is reshaping Iran's alliances. A weakened Iran becomes a more dependent Iran, more reliant on Russia for military support, more connected to Turkey through shared strategic interests, more integrated into exactly the coalition Ezekiel described. The 82nd Airborne is deploying to fight the nation the Bible names, and the pressure of that deployment may be the very force that drives Iran deeper into the prophetic alliance. Now, here's where I maintain the guardrails, and I need to walk through every unfulfilled condition, because the gaps between where we are and where Ezekiel says we're going are real, and pretending they don't exist would be dishonest. The first unfulfilled condition, and this is the most important one, is that Ezekiel 38 describes an invasion of Israel. Not an American-Israeli strike on Iran, an invasion of Israel by a coalition led from the north. And the current war is the opposite. In Ezekiel, the coalition attacks Israel. In the current conflict, the United States and Israel are attacking Iran. The 82nd Airborne is not deploying to defend Israel from an invasion. It is deploying to project American power against the nation Ezekiel named. The roles are reversed. The direction is wrong. And that reversal is not a minor detail. It is a fundamental structural difference between the current situation and the prophetic text. But here's what makes the second unfulfilled condition even more significant. Because it is the precondition that determines whether the Ezekiel 38 invasion can occur at all. Ezekiel 38:8. After many days thou shalt be visited. In the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, and is gathered out of many people, against the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. Israel dwelling safely. The Hebrew word is Betach, and it means in confidence, in security, without anxiety. Scholars debate whether Betach requires a formal peace agreement or simply a national posture of confidence. A nation that feels secure, that trusts its defenses, that believes the major threats have been neutralized. But regardless of which interpretation you hold, Israel is not dwelling in Betach right now. Israel is at war. Sirens are screaming in Tel Aviv. Missiles are falling from Hezbollah in the north and from Iran in the east. Civilians are running for shelters. The 82nd Airborne is deploying specifically because the threat level is at its highest point in Israel's modern history. That is not Betach. That is not dwelling safely. And until that condition is met, the Ezekiel 38 invasion cannot occur. But here's the question that should keep you watching. And this is where the current war becomes prophetically significant, even though it is not the fulfillment. What if this war is the event that creates the Betach condition? Think about what happens if Operation Epic Fury succeeds. Iran's ballistic missile capability, already reduced by 86%, is eliminated entirely. Iran's navy, already sunk, ceases to exist as a maritime threat. Iran's supreme leader is dead, its missiles destroyed, its navy sunk, its leadership eliminated, its proxies broken. In that post-war environment, Israel would have reason to feel more secure than at any point since its founding. The Abraham Accords could expand, Saudi Arabia normalizing relations, a regional security architecture forming, economic integration deepening. Israel's Iron Dome, David's sling, and arrow defense systems, already the most advanced multi-layered missile defense on Earth, would face a threat environment dramatically reduced from pre-war levels. And the national mood, the collective psychology of a nation that just watched its greatest enemy dismantled, would shift from anxiety to confidence. That is Betach. That is dwelling safely. Not because every threat has been eliminated, but because the nation believes the existential threats have been removed. And that belief, that confidence, that security posture, is exactly what Ezekiel describes as the condition that precedes the invasion. And here's what makes that scenario so unsettling. Because Betach is not safety. It is the feeling of safety. And feelings can be wrong. Ezekiel 38:11 says the invaders will say, "I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, and having neither bars nor gates." Unwalled villages. No bars, no gates. A nation so confident in its security that it has lowered its guard. And the invasion comes precisely when the guard is down, when the confidence is highest, when the memory of the last war has faded just enough to make complacency possible. The current war could be creating the very confidence that makes Israel vulnerable to the next one. But here's the third unfulfilled condition, and this is the one that definitively separates the current conflict from Ezekiel 38. The supernatural intervention has not occurred. Ezekiel 38:18 through 23 describes God's response to the invasion in terms that are unmistakable. A great earthquake in the land of Israel, every wall falling to the ground, confusion among the enemy ranks causing them to turn their swords against each other, pestilence and blood, an overflowing rain with great hailstones, fire and brimstone. God Himself destroys the invading coalition, not through Israeli military capability, not through American air power, not through human strategy, through direct, visible, supernatural intervention that demonstrates to every nation on earth that the God of Israel is God. None of that has happened. The current war is being fought with F-22s and Tomahawk missiles and marine assault ships, not with fire from heaven and hailstones. The victory, if it comes, will be attributed to American and Israeli military power, not to divine intervention. And the purpose of the Ezekiel 38 war is specifically stated. "And I will be known in the eyes of many nations, and they shall know that I am the Lord." The nations must know that God did it. And as long as the victory can be explained by human military capability, the Ezekiel 38 paradigm has not been activated. The roles are reversed. Israel is not dwelling safely, and the supernatural intervention has not occurred. Those are the gaps. They are real. They are significant. And ignoring them would be dishonest. But here's what the honest assessment also requires. The nation Ezekiel named Persia is at the center of the conflict. The alliances Ezekiel described, Russia, Iran, Turkey, are deepening under the pressure of this war. The 82nd Airborne is deploying ground forces to confront the exact nation listed in the coalition. The military buildup in the biblical lands is creating a concentration of Gentile power without historical precedent. And the outcome of this war, whether it produces an Iran that is reconciled to the West or radicalized against it, whether it creates a post-war Israel dwelling in confidence or a post-war Israel still under threat, whether it drives Persia deeper into the Russian-Turkish axis or separates it from that axis, could determine whether the Ezekiel 38 preconditions form in this generation. And Jeremiah 49:38 adds, "And I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy from thence the king and the princes, saith the Lord." The king, Khamenei, reportedly killed or gravely injured. The princes, over 40 senior IRGC commanders eliminated. And I will set my throne, which many scholars connect to the explosive growth of the underground church in Iran. Hundreds of thousands coming to faith through dreams and visions in a nation where conversion carries the death penalty. God's throne being set not through military conquest, but through spiritual transformation, in the land where the 82nd Airborne is deploying. And Jeremiah 49:39. "But it shall come to pass in the latter days, that I will bring again the captivity of Elam, saith the Lord." Restoration, in the latter days, after the breaking, after the destruction, after the throne is set. The story of Iran does not end in judgment. It ends in restoration, by the same God who broke the bow and destroyed the princes. This is not the fulfillment of Ezekiel 38. The conditions are not met. The gaps are real. But the trajectory, the direction of every alliance, every deployment, every strike, every negotiation, is moving toward the prophetic picture, not away from it. And the 82nd Airborne's deployment is the latest step in a trajectory that has been accelerating since the first strike of Operation Epic Fury. This is not the prophecy, but it may be the war that creates the conditions for it. And the distance between the conditions and the fulfillment is shorter today than it was yesterday. And here's what the New Testament adds. Because Ezekiel is not the only biblical voice that describes foreign nations present in the land of Israel during the end times, and this verse describes something even more specific: a sustained Gentile military presence in the Holy Land itself. Revelation 11:2. "But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months." Gentile nations in the Holy Land for 42 months, the duration of the Great Tribulation. And right now, Gentile military forces, American F-22s at Israeli air bases, American tankers at Ben Gurion, thousands of Marines converging on the region, and now the 82nd Airborne deploying its command element, are present in and around the land of Israel in unprecedented numbers. This is not the 42-month trampling that Revelation describes. The temple has not been rebuilt. The two witnesses have not appeared. The tribulation has not begun. But the image, Gentile forces on the Holy Land during a time of crisis, resonates with the verse in a way that no previous military deployment has matched. And the 82nd Airborne's deployment adds another layer of Gentile military presence to a picture that is already without historical precedent. Now, let me zoom out and show you the full pattern, because individual deployments are data points. But the pattern those data points create is what tells you where the trajectory is heading. American F-22 stealth fighters deployed to Israeli soil, first time in history. American aerial refueling tankers at Ben Gurion Airport, unprecedented. 4 carrier strike groups in or heading toward the region. Over 50,000 American troops in the Middle East. 2 Marine expeditionary units converging. 1 from the Pacific, 1 from the West Coast. The 82nd Airborne's command element ordered to deploy. Israeli forces conducting simultaneous operations across multiple fronts. Russian naval assets in the Mediterranean. Turkish forces on alert along the Syrian border. Iranian forces, degraded but still fighting, across the Gulf. But here's what makes this convergence more than just a military buildup. And this is the detail that should make every person watching this lean forward. Because the nations converging are the nations the prophets named: Persia, Iran; Magog, associated with Russia; Meshech and Tubal, associated with Turkey; and the Gentile forces gathering around Israel, American, multinational, unprecedented in scale, match the picture Revelation describes of foreign nations present in the Holy Land during the final period. Multiple nations entering the region, a growing military footprint, alliances forming and deepening, and a concentration of military power in the biblical lands that is accelerating with every deployment order. The pattern is forming. And here's what Jesus said about exactly the kind of world we're watching form. Because his words in Matthew 24 describe this atmosphere with a precision that leaves no room for coincidence. And what makes the passage so striking is that he wasn't speaking generally. He was answering a specific question, asked by his own disciples on the Mount of Olives, looking across at the temple, about what the end of the age would look like before it arrived. Matthew 24:3. Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? What are the signs? How will we know? What does the approach of the end look like? And Jesus' answer, the Olivet Discourse, is the most comprehensive prophetic teaching he ever delivered. It is his roadmap, his warning system, his description of the world that would exist in the generation that sees the end approach. And the first sign he lists is the one you are watching unfold on your phone right now. Matthew 24:6-8. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Now let me map each element to the present, because the alignment between Jesus' description and the world of March 2026 is not abstract. It is specific, measurable, and accelerating. Wars. The United States is at war with Iran. Israel is conducting simultaneous operations across multiple fronts. Iran, Lebanon, Syria. Operation Epic Fury has struck over 9,000 targets. More than 140 Iranian vessels destroyed. And as of today, the 82nd Airborne Division, the unit that deploys when ground war begins, has received orders to move to the theater. This is not a single conflict. It is a cascading series of wars, each one feeding the next, each one drawing in additional nations, each one expanding the scope and the stakes. But here's what makes the second element even more relevant right now, because the rumors may be more destabilizing than the combat itself. Rumors of wars. Ground invasion speculation dominates every news cycle. Will the Marines assault Karg Island? Will the 82nd Airborne conduct parachute operations into Iranian territory? Will the Strait of Hormuz be cleared by force? Will Iran respond with a nuclear weapon if its territory is invaded? Will China move on Taiwan while American forces are committed to the Gulf? The 82nd Airborne deployment didn't just add troops to the theater, it added a new category of rumors. Because the presence of ground assault forces creates the possibility of ground assault, and the possibility, the rumor, spreads faster than the deployment itself. The fear of a ground war is now shaping markets, elections, alliances, and public opinion across every continent. The rumors are as destabilizing as the combat, and Jesus listed them both, wars and rumors of wars, because he understood that the atmosphere of conflict is as prophetically significant as the conflict itself. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. The Greek, ethnos against ethnos, basileia against basileia, describes conflict at every level simultaneously. Not a single war between two nations. A matrix of conflicts involving multiple nations, multiple alliances, and multiple fault lines operating at the same time. The United States and Israel against Iran. Iran against the Gulf states. Over 314 ballistic missiles launched at the UAE alone. Hezbollah against Israel in the north. Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea. Iraqi Shia militias targeting American bases. Russia aligned with Iran diplomatically and militarily. Turkey drifting between NATO and the Eurasian Axis. And now American ground forces, the 82nd Airborne, 5,000 Marines, converging on the same region where all these conflicts intersect. But these are not the only signs Jesus gave us. To watch the complete signs, click here.